The cattle were still breathing. That's what Herman Vogel noticed first when he descended the earthen ramp into his underground barn on the morning of January 12, 1888, after the worst blizzard Dakota Territory had seen in 20 years. Outside, the temperature held at 41 degrees below zero. The wind hadn't stopped screaming for 63 hours. And yet here, 18 feet beneath the frozen prairie, his 12 Holstein dairy cows stood calm in their stalls, condensation rising from their backs in the lamplight. No fire, no stove, just earth and air and the stubborn heat of living things. 300 yards away, through snowdrifts that buried fence posts to their tops, his neighbor's barn stood as a monument to conventional wisdom and dead livestock. 11 months earlier, Herman Vogel made a decision that turned him into the laughingstock of Hutchinson County. The German immigrant had filed a homestead claim on a quarter section 12 miles northwest of Menno in 1886. By March of 1887, he'd saved enough to purchase dairy cattle from a farmer in Yankton. And that's when Herman announced he wasn't building his barn above ground. He was digging it into the earth instead. You planning to bury those cows or raise them? That was Thomas Mackenzie, a Scottish homesteader who'd been in the territory since 1883. He'd survived 3 Dakota winters and figured he'd learned enough to recognize idiocy when he heard it. Herman didn't look up from his sketch. The earth stays 54 degrees year-round at 10 feet down. Above ground, barn gets hot in summer, cold in winter. Below ground, temperature stays steady. That's the damnedest thing I ever heard, Mackenzie said. You got any idea how much dirt that is? 1,900 cubic yards, Herman replied. Already calculated. Greta brought coffee to the table. Back in Schleswig-Holstein, Herman had worked for a civil engineer. He understood earth and stone better than most, even if his English couldn't always explain it properly. Reverend Samuel Clayton rode out 2 days later, a former Union Army chaplain who'd buried enough settlers to have strong opinions about what kept people alive in harsh country. Brother Vogel, Clayton said, settling onto Herman's porch, I've been hearing troubling reports about your barn plans. The Lord put animals on the surface of the earth for a reason. You start putting creatures below ground, you're asking for disease, rot, bad air. We'll have ventilation, Herman said. 2 shafts, opposite ends. Natural airflow. Son, I've been in this territory since 1870. You put a barn in the ground and the first spring melt's gonna fill it like a soup pot. Barn will be above water table. Floor will pitch toward drain. Clayton had watched 17 families fail in Dakota Territory, watched children die from exposure. His skepticism came from experience that earns respect, even when it's wrong. If you're watching this because you value the kind of traditional knowledge that kept people alive when one wrong decision meant death, hit that subscribe button now. We're documenting techniques that modern agriculture has forgotten, and every subscriber helps preserve this frontier wisdom for future generations. Josef Novak was a Czech immigrant who'd studied engineering in Prague. When he heard about Herman's plan, he came not to mock but to lecture. You understand thermodynamics? Novak asked at the edge of Herman's excavation. Understand Earth holds heat, Herman replied, waist deep in dirt. Earth doesn't hold heat, it has thermal mass. Big difference. Your cows generate maybe 2,000 BTU per animal per hour. Below ground, thermal mass absorbs that heat. Your cows might actually be colder than in regular barn. But Novak was genuinely interested in being proven wrong. Engineers love problems that challenge assumptions. He came back with paper and pencil, and the 2 men worked through heat loss equations while their wives shared coffee. The 4th skeptic was William Stratton, who owned the feed store in Menno and controlled credit for most homesteaders. I'll extend you credit for a normal barn, Stratton said, but I'm not financing some experimental hole in the ground. You want to dig yourself a grave for dairy cows, you do it on your own dime. Herman and Greta redistributed their tiny reserve of cash that night. Food budget cut by 1/3, no new clothing. Everything spare went toward the barn. By mid-April, the excavation measured 32 feet long, 18 feet wide, and would eventually reach 12 feet deep. Herman broke ground with a plow pulled by oxen. Then came the digging, pickaxe and shovel, hour after hour, day after day. He hauled dirt up in wooden buckets, spreading it in berms that would eventually form walls. Thomas Mackenzie watched Herman work, then shook his head. You're gonna kill yourself. That's 2 months of labor, maybe 3, all for something that might not even work. Will work, Herman replied without stopping. How do you know? Herman paused, leaning on his shovel. In old country, my uncle kept root cellar. Potatoes, turnips, cabbage. Stayed good all winter. Stayed cool all summer. Same principle. Earth keeps steady temperature. Root cellar's different than barn. Vegetables don't breathe like cattle. This why I dig 2 ventilation shafts. Air comes in here, gets warmed by animals and earth, rises out there. Natural circulation. By May, neighbors gathered on Sundays to watch Herman's progress like a slow-motion train wreck. The excavation was now 8 feet deep. Herman set massive cottonwood posts every 6 feet, sunk 3 feet into earth and tamped solid. Across these he laid cross beams salvaged from an abandoned claim shack. Reverend Clayton stood at the pit's edge. You're committed now, no turning back. Was committed when I started digging, Herman replied. By late June, the roof beams were covered with smaller poles, thick prairie grass matting, then 18 inches of earth sloped to shed water. From a distance, the barn looked like a long, low hill with a ramp descending into shadow and 2 strange chimneys poking up at intervals. Joseph Novak returned with calculations. I was wrong about some things. Thermal mass works both directions. In summer, it pulls heat away, keeps animals cool. In winter, if ventilation is correct, air should stay around 45 to 50 degrees, even when outside is below 0. What about minus 30? Minus 40? Novak's expression darkened. That's different. At extreme cold, you're losing heat through ventilation itself. Every cubic foot of air that enters cold and leaves warm, that's heat you're losing. Herman had built adjustable baffles into both ventilation shafts. Novak examined them, nodding slowly. Might work, might not. We won't know until winter. By August, the barn was complete enough for cattle. Herman had purchased his 12 Holsteins in June. Now he led them down the ramp one by one. They balked at darkness, but within an hour all 12 were exploring their new home. The barn measured 32 feet long and 18 feet wide inside, with a 7-foot ceiling at center. Herman had built stanchions along both walls, 6 on each side, with a 4-foot wide center aisle. Greta came down that first evening. It's quiet, she said. The earth walls absorbed sound. And cool, Herman added. Outside, the temperature pushed 92 degrees. Inside, maybe 65. Thomas Mackenzie stopped by the next week. Lost a cow yesterday. Heat stroke. 4th one in 3 years during August. Herman said nothing, but both men understood. Inside the underground barn, the cows were contentedly chewing cud in their cool shelter. September brought a thunderstorm, 3 inches in 2 hours. Herman watched water run off the earthen roof, watched drainage channels carry seepage away. By evening, the barn was dry except near the entrance. I'll be damned, Mackenzie said. Might actually work. October brought frost and nighttime lows in the 20s. Inside the barn, thermometer readings held between 48 and 52 degrees without any heat source beyond the cattle themselves. Joseph Novak came with his notebook, recording temperatures. Thermal mass is working exactly as predicted. Earth is acting as a battery, storing heat during day, releasing it at night. And if external temperature drops too far below freezing for too long? Novak closed his notebook. Then we find out if your cows generate enough heat to overcome the loss. That's the experiment we're all waiting for. November was mild, which made Herman nervous. Temperatures mostly in the 20s and 30s. The barn handled it easily, staying in the mid-40s inside. December brought the cold. On December 8th, the temperature dropped to 8 below and stayed there 4 days. Herman monitored his barn constantly, adjusting ventilation baffles to minimize heat loss while preventing stale air. Interior temperature dropped to 39 degrees. Cold enough to need watchful management, but not enough to stress the animals. Mackenzie's barn required a stove burning day and night, burning through my woodpile twice as fast as I planned. But at least my cows aren't freezing. Neither are mine, Herman replied. Reverend Clayton preached about humility in late December, and though he didn't mention Herman by name, everyone understood the subtext. After the service, Clayton pulled Herman aside. "I may have been hasty in my judgment, but winter's not over yet. January and February are when Dakota shows its teeth." Herman nodded. "I know." On January 10, 1888, the sky took on a peculiar yellow cast. The temperature was unusually warm for winter, 36 degrees at midday. Herman had been around long enough to recognize what was coming. He spent the afternoon hauling extra hay down into the barn, filling every water bucket he owned, moving his family's emergency supplies into the root cellar attached to the house. "Storm's coming," he told Greta. She didn't question him, just started preparing food that could be eaten cold if the fire went out. By evening, the wind had picked up, shifting to the northwest. The temperature started dropping, 1 degree every 15 minutes. By midnight, it was 12 above zero. By 2 in the morning, it was 4 below. And then the snow started. What would become known as the schoolhouse blizzard, or the children's blizzard, hit Dakota territory on January 12, 1888, with wind speeds exceeding 70 miles per hour and temperatures that plunged to 43 degrees below zero in some areas. It caught people unprepared because the morning had been deceptively mild. Children were at school, farmers were doing chores. And then, in the space of an hour, the world became white death. Herman made it to the barn just after the snow started. He'd learned from older settlers to run a rope between the house and any outbuilding you might need to reach in a storm, a lifeline in whiteout conditions. He clipped himself to that rope and fought his way the 300 yards to the barn entrance, snow already accumulating in drifts that would eventually reach 6 and 7 feet deep. Inside the underground barn, the cattle were restless but not panicked. The sound of the wind above ground was muffled by the earth, reaching the interior as a distant howl rather than the immediate shriek it was above. Herman checked the ventilation shafts. Both were still drawing air, though he'd already closed the baffles halfway. He checked water buckets, hay supplies, the stability of the stanchions. Everything was secure. And then he had a decision to make. The temperature inside the barn was 41 degrees and holding. Outside it was dropping fast, already 10 below when he'd made his way across, likely 15 or 20 below by now. Every experienced settler knew the protocol. When a blizzard hits, you stay where you are until it passes. Moving in whiteout conditions was suicide. But Herman had 3 children in that house with Greta, and no way to know if the house would hold or if they'd need him. He made it back to the house following the rope line, ice forming in his beard, his fingers numb inside 2 layers of mittens. The return journey took 20 minutes, 300 yards that felt like 3 miles. The house held, barely. The wind screamed around the frame structure, finding every gap in the walls, sending flour-fine snow through cracks they hadn't known existed. Greta had the children in the center of the house, away from outside walls, wrapped in every blanket they owned. The temperature inside the house was maybe 20 degrees despite the fire going full blast. The blizzard lasted 63 hours. 63 hours of wind that didn't stop, snow that didn't stop, cold that reached into every corner of every structure on the northern plains. Herman and his family burned through their entire wood supply, then started burning furniture. The children cried from cold until they were too tired to cry. Greta wrapped hot rocks from the fire in cloth and tucked them under blankets, reheating them every hour. They rationed food because the idea of the storm lasting this long hadn't seemed possible. All across Dakota territory, the same scene was playing out. Farmers caught between buildings, frozen to death within yards of shelter. Children walking home from school, lost in the sudden whiteout, found days later under snowdrifts. Livestock in conventional barns pressed together for warmth, some surviving, many freezing despite their shelter. In Thomas Mackenzie's barn, the stove went out on the second day when the wood ran out. By the time the storm passed, he'd lost 4 cows and his ox. The animals had frozen to death despite being in an enclosed structure, despite being together, despite everything Mackenzie knew about keeping livestock alive in winter. 3 miles to the east, Joseph Novak's barn lost its roof when the snow load exceeded what the structure could bear. The roof collapsed at 2 a.m. on the second night of the storm, burying 3 of his 5 cows and leaving the others exposed to the full force of the blizzard. All 5 died. William Stratton, the feed store owner, lost his entire flock of chickens and both his plow horses. Reverend Clayton's barn lost 2 walls when the wind tore them from their foundations. The Reverend saved his cattle by bringing them into his house, literally into his front room, where they stood for 2 days while his family retreated to the bedroom. The cattle survived, but the house was a disaster of manure and destruction that would take months to repair. And in Herman Vogel's underground barn, 18 feet below the howling surface, 12 Holstein dairy cows stood in their stanchions and breathed easy. When the wind finally stopped on the afternoon of January 15th, the silence was almost shocking. Herman dug his way out of the house. The door was blocked by a snowdrift that had built to the roofline and stood in a landscape transformed. Snow covered everything to a depth of 4 feet on the level ground, 8 and 10 feet in drifts. The temperature was 41 below zero, and the sky was that crystalline blue that only comes after massive storms. He found the rope line buried, dug it out, followed it to where the barn entrance should be. The entrance was completely buried, filled with snow that had drifted and packed solid. Herman started digging, working until his breath froze in the scarf Greta had wrapped around his face, then working more. It took 3 hours to clear a path down the ramp to the door. The door opened inward, and the first thing Herman noticed was warmth. Not warm by human standards, but warm compared to the killing cold outside. The thermometer inside the barn read 34 degrees, 7 degrees above freezing, 48 degrees warmer than the outside air. The second thing he noticed was the smell. 12 cows in an enclosed space for 3 days without mucking creates a powerful atmosphere. But underneath that smell was something else. The smell of living animals, warm and breathing and alive. The third thing he noticed was their condition. They were fine, stressed certainly. They'd been without water for most of the storm, and the hay supply was getting low. But they were on their feet, they were alert, they were healthy. Not a single injury, not a single death. 12 out of 12 survived. Herman stood in his underground barn and cried. Not dramatically. Frontier men didn't do dramatic. Just tears running down his face that froze in his beard as soon as they hit the cold air near the entrance. He cried for the animals that survived, for the gamble that paid off, for the knowledge that his calculations and his stubbornness and his willingness to ignore conventional wisdom had been proven right in the most brutal test Dakota Territory could deliver. If you care about preserving stories like this, about traditional techniques that saved lives and livestock when conventional wisdom failed, subscribe now. Every subscription helps keep this knowledge alive and accessible. Thomas Mackenzie came by 2 days after the storm, riding a borrowed horse because his ox was dead. He stood at the entrance to Herman's barn and watched the cattle chewing hay, peaceful and healthy, and he didn't say anything for a long time. "I lost 4, he finally said. "Froze despite the fire, despite everything." "I'm sorry," Herman said, and meant it. "Don't be," Mackenzie replied. "Be right instead. You were right, and I was wrong. And that's the truth of it." He came back a week later with his oldest son and a surveying chain. "I'm digging," he said. "Show me how you calculated the dimensions. Show me the grade for drainage. Show me everything." Joseph Novak arrived with a notebook full of calculations and a sheepish expression. "I miscalculated thermal retention in severe conditions," he admitted. "I assumed worst case was -20 for extended periods. Didn't account for -40. The thermal mass, it's not just about steady temperature. It's thermal buffer. Earth stores enough heat from moderate conditions to sustain system through short extreme conditions." "How short?" Herman asked. "Based on your barn's performance? Maybe 5-6 days of extreme cold before the buffer depletes. But Dakota storms don't usually last that long. This one was exceptional." Novak paused. "You were lucky, but you were also right. Sometimes that's the same thing." Reverend Clayton came on Sunday, bringing a pot of stew Greta's family had made. His face was haggard from the 2 days with cattle in his house and the month of cleanup ahead. "I preached about humility," Clayton said. "Seems God saw fit to teach me some." "Was just engineering," Herman replied. "Not prophecy." "Maybe so," Clayton said. "But tell me this, how'd you know it would work? How'd you have that kind of confidence?" Herman considered the question. "In old country I worked on tunnels, cellars, foundations. Always the earth? It's steady. Not like air, not like wood. Earth doesn't change moods with weather. People forget this because we live on top of Earth, not in it. But Earth remembers temperatures from summer, carries them into winter. Winter cold has to penetrate deep before it changes what Earth knows. This takes time. More time than most storms last. It was the longest explanation Herman had given anyone, and Clayton listened like a man hearing something important. You saying the Earth has memory? Thermal mass is kind of memory, Herman said. Heat from August still in Earth in January. We just have to dig deep enough to find it. By February, 7 homesteaders in the area were planning underground barns. By March, Thomas Mackenzie had broken ground on one. By June, a reporter from the Yankton Press in Dakotan rode out to interview Herman about the Dutchman's dugout barn that had saved a herd through the worst storm in territory history. The article was short. Newspapers in 1888 didn't waste column inches, but it spread word beyond Hutchinson County. Other German settlers, other immigrants who remembered earth-sheltered structures from Europe, started asking questions. How deep? What grade? How many ventilation shafts? Herman answered every question, shared every calculation, helped design 3 barns that summer for neighbors who'd initially mocked him. Not because he was vindicated, though he was, but because the knowledge mattered. In country where winter could kill your livestock in a night, good information was the difference between success and failure, between survival and starvation. William Stratton, the feed store owner who'd refused credit, sent a letter in March. He didn't apologize exactly, but the letter authorized credit for supplies Herman needed for spring planting, with terms generous enough to qualify as an admission of error. Joseph Novak published a paper in a Czech-language newspaper out of Omaha detailing the thermodynamic principles behind earth-sheltered structures. The paper included Herman's barn as a case study, complete with temperature measurements from the blizzard. No one knows how many readers the paper reached, but engineering knowledge spreads in unexpected ways through immigrant networks. The cattle themselves provided the final validation. That spring, Herman's 12 cows produced 34% more milk than the regional average. This wasn't coincidence. It was biology. Cattle that don't experience temperature stress, that don't burn energy maintaining body heat in extreme cold or dealing with extreme heat in summer, convert more feed into milk. The underground barn wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. By harvest time, 1888, Herman had paid off his debts, expanded his herd to 16 cows, and started planning a second structure, a root cellar connected to the barn by a short tunnel, using the same principles to store vegetables and preserved food. The initial excavation that everyone called wasteful had become a network of earth-sheltered spaces that regulated temperature, preserved food, protected animals, and reduced labor. But here's what really mattered, the piece that modern agriculture has largely forgotten. Herman's approach worked not because it was revolutionary, but because it was ancient. Humans have been building earth-sheltered structures for 10,000 years. From the pit houses of ancient peoples to the root cellars of European farms to the cliff dwellings of the Southwest, every culture that faced extreme temperature swings figured out the same solution: dig into the earth and let thermal mass do the work. The frontier era of American history had a peculiar kind of amnesia. Settlers arrived in new territory and immediately started building exactly the way they'd built back east, even when Eastern methods didn't match Western conditions. Frame houses on treeless plains, conventional barns in extreme climates. It took immigrants like Herman, people who brought knowledge from older agricultural traditions, to remember what the earth itself could provide. Modern comparisons exist if you know where to look. The passive house movement in contemporary green building uses many of the same principles Herman Vogel discovered through necessity: thermal mass, earth berming, controlled ventilation. Underground homes in Australia use Earth's steady temperature to eliminate or drastically reduce heating and cooling costs. Data centers, requiring constant temperature control, increasingly use geothermal principles similar to Herman's barn design. The knowledge never disappeared. We just stopped applying it to agriculture. There's a broader lesson here about skepticism and innovation on the frontier. Every skeptic in this story, Mackenzie, Clayton, Novak, Stratton, had legitimate reasons for their doubt. They weren't villains, they were experienced people applying hard-won knowledge from previous situations to a new problem. But experience can blind you to possibilities outside your existing framework. Hermann Vogel wasn't smarter than his skeptics. He was willing to trust older knowledge and run the experiment. That willingness came at significant personal cost. 4 months of brutal labor, financial stress, social isolation. The validation felt sweet, but it could easily have gone the other way. If the barn had failed during the blizzard, if the cattle had frozen or suffocated or drowned, Hermann would have been remembered as the fool everyone said he was. But he wasn't a fool. He was an immigrant who remembered what worked back home and adapted it to new conditions. He was an engineer who calculated thermal mass and drainage before anyone asked him to. He was a farmer willing to bet his family's survival on the belief that Earth's memory was longer than winter's reach. The original barn stood for 43 years. When it was finally abandoned in 1931, not because it failed, but because the farm itself was consolidated into a larger operation during the Depression. The earthen walls were still solid, the drainage still functional, the basic structure sound. 43 years of Dakota weather, including 3 more severe blizzards, and the barn did what it was designed to do: maintain steady temperature, protect livestock, and prove that sometimes the old ways survive because they work better than new ones. Hermann Vogel died in 1919, 31 years after the schoolhouse blizzard. His obituary in the Menno newspaper mentioned his service to the community, his family, his farm's success. It didn't mention the barn. By 1919, underground and earth-sheltered barns had become common enough in German immigrant communities that they weren't noteworthy anymore. The technique had spread, been refined, become ordinary, which is how you know an innovation has really succeeded, when it stops being innovative and becomes just the way things are done. Greta Vogel lived until 1942, long enough to see her grandchildren farming the same land Hermann had broken. Late in life, she told a story about the night of the blizzard, about sitting in that freezing house with 3 crying children and thinking about the cattle in their underground shelter. She'd been angry with Hermann for building that barn, she admitted, angry at the time it took, the money it cost, the ridicule it brought to their family. But when I realized the animals were going to live, she said, when I understood we'd still have milk come spring, still have calves to sell, still have the herd intact, that's when I stopped being angry and started being grateful. Hermann wasn't building a barn. He was building survival. The site of Hermann Vogel's homestead is still visible if you know where to look. The surface structures are gone. House, summer kitchen, tool shed all collapsed and reclaimed by prairie grass. But the barn leaves a signature in the landscape. There's a long, low depression where the excavation was, and in certain light you can see the outline of the entrance ramp. Local historians mark it on maps as Vogel Barn Site, and occasionally farmers or curious visitors stop to look at the place where one German immigrant defied conventional wisdom and proved that sometimes the earth provides better shelter than any structure built above it. In a way, Hermann's real innovation wasn't the barn itself. It was the willingness to trust principles over precedent, to calculate rather than copy, to remember that every solution evolved for a specific context, and new contexts might need different solutions. The frontier was full of people making decisions based on, this is how we always did it, and many of those decisions got people killed. Hermann survived because he was willing to ask, but does it work here? And then actually run the experiment. If this story made you think differently about traditional knowledge or innovation, if you value documentation of techniques that modern systems have forgotten, hit that like button. It helps more people find this content, and that means preserving more of this forgotten wisdom for future generations. The final word should probably go to Thomas Mackenzie, the Scottish skeptic who became Hermann's first convert. Years after the blizzard, after he'd built his own successful earth-sheltered barn, after he'd taught the technique to 2 other settlers, a visitor asked him why more people hadn't adopted the approach. Pride, Mackenzie said simply. Most folks would rather fail doing things the normal way than succeed doing something that makes them look peculiar. Hermann wasn't proud enough to care about looking peculiar. He just cared about keeping his cattle alive. That's the difference between a good farmer and a stubborn fool. Good farmers let results teach them. Fools let opinions teach them. Storm taught us all which one we'd been. The schoolhouse blizzard killed at least 235 people across the Midwest in January 1888. It destroyed thousands of buildings, killed tens of thousands of livestock, and changed how plains settlers thought about weather preparedness. But in a small barn 18 feet beneath the Dakota prairie, 12 Holstein cows stood breathing easy. Proof that sometimes the best way to face the future is to remember what the earth has always known. Deep enough, steady enough, and things stay alive even when the surface world is trying its hardest to kill them. That's a lesson worth digging for.